Chinese leaders have long staked their policies on the assumption of a rising East and a declining West. Well, China might already be past its prime. Let's find out why. Hey guys, welcome to the High Ground. My name is Fabio, and today we're talking about China. The topic of today's video is not an everyday topic, but I stumbled over an article by Yi Fuxian. He is a senior scientist in obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I found it to be a very interesting article. I want to share some of the contents with you, but also give you some warnings where I think that the predictions might already be a little bit out of line with what we really can expect. Now, as said, there are some issues with this article, and I will divide these videos in facts that are objectively provable and in opinions that Mr. Fujian has that are still very interesting, so we should talk about them. The Chinese government acknowledged in January for the first time that China's population is shrinking. This is surprising because it is roughly 9 years earlier than the Chinese government and the UN, which might at some point be the same, predicted. The fertility rate sank to 1.1 to 1.0 children per woman. The birth rate was significantly lower than the 1.8 children per woman predicted earlier. To be precise, the birth rate is at its lowest since 790, the beginning of collection of data. So, and that all despite that the Chinese government stepped away from the one-child policy in 2016. What are the reasons for that? Well, the first reason is that the numbers in the previous years were overall inflated. This is nothing unusual within an autocratic government where everybody just tries to report good numbers. We have seen that before in other countries. This is also why the World Population Prospect of the UN, which is generally quite reliable, is usually wrong when it comes to China. They just get the wrong data. The second reason is, and I will now need my notes here. Now, China had the one-child policy, so everybody was only allowed to have one kid, and that made having kids quite expensive. If we look at the allocation of the gross domestic product, only 44% of the gross domestic product is available to the Chinese populace, compared to 76%, for example, in the US and 69% in the UK. At the same time, the Chinese housing market is valued at 4 times the GDP. While, for example, in the US, still very expensive, the housing market is only valued about 1.6 times the GDP. That means, even though they are all communists, living space is really expensive in China. Take this, Bernie. The third reason is that Chinese women get older and older before they try to have their first kid. The infertility rate rose from 2% in the early 80s up to 18% in 2020. All the while, the number of marriages fell by more than 50% between 2010 and 2020. In a recent study, Chinese women born after 2000 wanted to have, in an average, 1.4 kids per woman. Compared to a Western country that is still in the same region, South Korea, there the women wanted to have 1.9 kids per woman. Now, these were all the fact parts. You can find these facts on the internet. I looked them up And all of these facts and numbers seem pretty legit to me. Now, there is also a prediction part in this article, and this is where we are now in the opinion part. If this whole development would continue, Fujian estimates that the population of China will decline down to roughly 300 million in the year 2100. But even if the Chinese government would manage to stabilize birthing rates on the current level, and no government ever actually managed to do that, even then the population would decline to roughly 450 million. And this is where the really interesting stuff starts. Less babies means older society. Fujian predicts that in 2030, at the current rate, the Chinese society will have a median age that is already 5.5 years above the median age of the US society. He predicts that in 2033, the old age dependency ratio, so the ratio between the workforce and the retired people, will already exceed America's old age dependency ratio. China's GDP growth rate will begin to fall below America's between 2031 and 2035, according to this estimation. That means at this point, the per capita GDP will only be roughly 30% of America's per capita GDP, and not 50 to 75% as predicted in earlier simulations. Now, China is, as a countermeasurement, investing heavily in artificial intelligence and robotics to offset the loss in workforce. The author of this article argues that these measurements will only go so far because of two reasons. The first thing is that innovation relies on young minds. And that's not fully true that you can determine the innovation capability of a society by its median age, because then Uganda would be one of the most innovative countries in the world. If you look at statistics, the most innovative countries are actually countries with a median age roughly around 40. But I agree with his second argument. He says that a robotic workforce doesn't consume anything, and consumption is one of the main drivers of economic growth. My personal opinion to this, if those numbers are actually true, the sinews of war are infinite amounts of money. That's Cicero, and that doesn't really look good for China. According to Fujian, China's decline will be gradual. It will remain the world's second or third largest economy for years to come. But the huge gap between its waning demographic and economic strength and its expanding political ambitions might make it highly vulnerable to political and strategic misjudgments. And he brought a very nice quote here that I'd like to read you. Memories of past glory or fear of lost status could lead it down the same dangerous path that Russia has taken in Ukraine. Well, if that's not a verdict, I don't know what is. But there are also some lessons that we can take away. We didn't do a really good job in managing a declining Russia. That's obvious because otherwise we wouldn't be in the mess that we have now in the Ukraine. Now, these were the main contents of this article. I found it very interesting. I still want to give you a few words of warning, but I will also link to the article in the description below. Now, I talked to some different friends of mine, some of them from the, you could say, intelligence community, and this article has a very common structure within academic troll articles. That means you have think tanks in the US that are highly funded and that are used to produce articles and research that is really supporting a certain politic narrative. Now, I can't tell you if this is a US narrative because, well, I don't see a lot of people actually playing down the danger from China. But I also can't tell you if this might be a Chinese narrative because they could be interested in holding up this narrative because the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was making the world believe that he doesn't exist, right? So we could also be influenced from this side here. This means take especially the opinions and the conclusions of the decline of China with a grain of salt. The facts are still very interesting. I found them worth sharing with you. I hope you took something with you from this video, found it interesting. If you did so, please give me a thumbs up. If you have any questions, post it in the comments. Remember to follow the channel, hit that notification bell. I really appreciate the time you spent watching this video, and I'll see you next time.